Before we start, if you want more stories about the biggest frauds and financial scandals that actually matter, hit subscribe now. We break down the most insane business stories into content you can actually understand. New video every week. Let's go. Imagine being 19 years old and dropping out of college to start a company. Now imagine that company becoming worth $9 billion. You're on magazine covers. You're called the next Steve Jobs, the youngest self-made female billionaire in history. Presidents want to meet you. Celebrities invest in your company. And then imagine it was all a lie, every single bit of it. A fraud so massive that you end up in federal prison. This is the story of Elizabeth Holmes. But here's what makes this different from every other fraud story you've heard. She wasn't some Wall Street veteran running a complex scheme. She was a college dropout who convinced some of the smartest people in America to believe in technology that didn't exist. She fooled former cabinet secretaries, she fooled billionaire investors, she fooled the media, and she almost got away with it. By the time you finish this video, you'll understand exactly how she did it, the psychological tricks she used, the lies she told, the people she destroyed, and why her story is a warning about Silicon Valley, about ambition, and about what happens when nobody asks the hard questions. But first, we need to go back to where it started. Because the Elizabeth Holmes story doesn't begin with fraud, it begins with a dream. Elizabeth Ann Holmes was born in Washington in 1984. Her father worked for government agencies. Her mother worked in Congress. This was a family with connections to power. Elizabeth grew up around politics and ambition. From childhood, she was driven, competitive, obsessed with success. But here's the thing that everyone who knew young Elizabeth remembers. She wasn't just ambitious, she was already crafting an image, already controlling how people saw her, already playing a role. Her relatives later said she seemed to be performing even as a child, trying to be something she wasn't quite naturally. In high school, Elizabeth became obsessed with business and innovation. She read about entrepreneurs, she studied successful founders, and she became particularly fascinated by Steve Jobs and Apple, the visionary founder who dropped out of college and changed the world. That image stuck with her. That became the template. She was a good student, smart enough to get into Stanford University, one of the most prestigious schools in America. She enrolled in chemical engineering. This is important because it gave her just enough technical knowledge to sound credible when talking about science, but not enough to actually build what she would later claim to have built, just enough to be dangerous. At Stanford, Elizabeth met a professor who would inadvertently plant the seed for her company. This professor worked on medical devices and diagnostic systems. Elizabeth became interested in the idea of making medical testing easier, faster, more accessible. This wasn't a bad idea. This was actually a good problem to solve. The traditional way of testing blood required drawing multiple vials from your arm with a needle. It was uncomfortable, it was slow, results took days, and it required going to a lab or hospital. What if Elizabeth thought you could test blood with just a finger prick? What if you could run hundreds of tests from a single drop of blood? What if results came back in hours instead of days? This vision became her obsession. She started working on early concepts. She filed a patent application, and then she made the decision that would define her life. In 2003, at 19 years old, she dropped out of Stanford. She was gonna build this company. She was gonna change the world, just like Steve Jobs. Her parents weren't happy, but they supported her. Her father helped with some initial funding. She named the company Theranos, a combination of therapy and diagnosis. The pitch was simple and compelling. Revolutionary blood testing technology, a finger prick instead of a needle. Hundreds of tests from a single drop of blood, results in hours, cheaper, faster, better. Now here's where the story gets interesting. Because this pitch worked, Elizabeth raised her first funding round, then another, then another. By 2004, she had raised millions from investors, but here's what none of them knew. The technology didn't work, at least not the way she was describing it. The fundamental problem Elizabeth was trying to solve was real. Traditional blood testing had limitations, but the solution she was proposing violated basic laws of chemistry and physics. You can't run hundreds of different tests on a single drop of blood with any reliability. The sample size is too small. Different tests require different amounts of blood. Some tests need blood serum, others need whole blood. The chemistry doesn't scale down like that. Scientists knew this, experts in diagnostics knew this, but Elizabeth wasn't talking to scientists, she was talking to investors. And investors don't necessarily understand the technical limitations. They hear the vision, they see the market opportunity, they look at the founder and try to decide if she can execute. And Elizabeth was very good at making people believe she could execute. She started adopting mannerisms and behaviors designed to project confidence and authority. The most famous was her voice. People who knew Elizabeth in high school and college remember her speaking in a normal female voice. But sometime in her early 20s, she started speaking in a deep baritone voice. Unnaturally deep for a woman, almost masculine. Why did she do this? Likely because she believed it made her sound more authoritative, more serious, more like a CEO. There's actually research showing that people perceive deeper voices as more trustworthy and competent. Elizabeth seemed to understand this instinctively. She crafted a persona, and the voice was part of it. She also adopted Steve Jobs' aesthetic. Black turtlenecks, every day, no variation. This wasn't just fashion, this was branding. She was positioning herself as the next Jobs, the visionary, the dropout who would change the world, and it worked. People started making the comparison without her having to say it. By 2010, Theranos had raised over $90 million. The company was valued at hundreds of millions. Elizabeth was becoming a known figure in Silicon Valley, but the technology still didn't work, not even close. The devices they were building couldn't do what she claimed. They were unreliable, they gave incorrect results. They couldn't run the range of tests she had promised. So what did Elizabeth do? Did she pivot? Did she tell investors the truth? Did she scale back the claims? No, she doubled down. She got better at hiding the problems. She created layers of secrecy within the company. She started demonstrating the technology to investors and partners using elaborate deceptions. Here's how it worked. When important visitors came to Theranos headquarters, they would be shown the device. It was called the Edison, named after Thomas Edison. It looked impressive, sleek, high-tech. They would watch as a technician did a finger prick, put a drop of blood into the device, and moments later results would appear on a screen. Impressive, right? Revolutionary, except the device wasn't actually running the tests. Behind the scenes, employees were taking the blood sample and running it on traditional commercial testing machines made by other companies. The Edison was just for show. It was theater. The real testing was happening in a back room using conventional equipment, but the visitors didn't know that. They saw what Elizabeth wanted them to see. This is fraud. This is deliberate deception, but it's important to understand the psychology of why it worked. These weren't stupid people being fooled. These were smart, successful investors and business leaders, but they wanted to believe. The story was compelling. The market opportunity was real, and Elizabeth was convincing. She would look investors in the eye with complete confidence and tell them the technology worked. She would show them fake demonstrations. She would produce documents with fabricated data. She would introduce them to advisors and board members with impressive credentials. Everything was designed to create believability, and it worked spectacularly. In 2013, Theranos announced a partnership with Walgreens, one of the largest pharmacy chains in America. Theranos would put their testing centers inside Walgreens stores. Customers could walk in, get a finger prick, and have their blood tested on the spot. This was exactly the vision Elizabeth had been selling. Walgreens was a huge validation. If a major corporation with due diligence teams and lawyers was partnering with Theranos, the technology must be real, right? That's what everyone assumed. What they didn't know was that Walgreens had been deceived too. They had raised concerns about the technology during their evaluation. They had asked to see validation data. They had requested to inspect the devices closely. Elizabeth and her team had blocked these requests. They had claimed trade secrets. They had provided limited demonstrations under controlled conditions. They had shown just enough to keep Walgreens interested without revealing that the technology didn't actually work. And Walgreens, eager to get ahead of competitors, had accepted this. They signed the deal. The same thing happened with Safeway, another major retailer. They invested hundreds of millions of dollars renovating their stores to accommodate Theranos testing centers. They were betting big on this partnership, and they had been shown the same fake demonstrations, told the same lies, given the same false confidence. By 2014, Theranos was valued at $9 billion. Elizabeth's stake was worth $4.5 billion on paper. At 30 years old, she was the youngest self-made female billionaire in history. She was on the cover of Fortune magazine, Forbes, Inc. She was profiled in The New Yorker. She gave a talk that went viral. She was everywhere. The media loved her story. Stanford dropout, female founder in male-dominated tech, revolutionary healthcare innovation, billionaire before 30, black turtlenecks and deep voice. She was a character. She was compelling. And nobody in the media was asking the hard technical questions. They were journalists, not scientists. They reported what she told them. They believed the story she was selling. But inside Theranos, things were falling apart. The technology still didn't work. Employees who raised concerns were fired. Some were threatened with lawsuits. The company culture was toxic, paranoid, secretive. Elizabeth's boyfriend and second in command, a man much older than her who had no medical or scientific training, was running operations with an iron fist. Dissenters were eliminated. The testing centers in Walgreens and Safeway were producing results, but they were using the same trick. Blood samples were being sent to a lab and run on traditional commercial machines. The proprietary Theranos devices were barely functional. When they were used, they gave wildly inconsistent results, but customers didn't know this. They trusted the Theranos brand. This created a dangerous situation. People were making medical decisions based on inaccurate test results. Someone might get a false positive for a serious condition and undergo unnecessary treatment. Or worse, a false negative might mean a real condition went undetected and untreated. This wasn't just fraud anymore. This was endangering lives. Some Theranos employees couldn't handle it anymore. They had gotten into the company believing they were doing important work, helping people, advancing medicine, but they realized they were part of a fraud. Some quit and tried to move on, but a few decided to speak out. This is where everything started to unravel. One former employee contacted a reporter. This reporter worked for the Wall Street Journal, one of the most respected newspapers in America. His name was John Carreyrou. He was an investigative journalist with a track record of exposing corporate fraud, and when he started hearing stories about Theranos from former employees, he smelled a story, a big one. Carreyrou started investigating. He contacted more former employees. He spoke with medical experts. He looked at the scientific claims Theranos was making, and he realized that the technology Elizabeth claimed to have developed was likely impossible given the known laws of chemistry and physics. The story didn't add up. He reached out to Theranos for comment. This is standard journalism practice. You give the company a chance to respond before publishing. Elizabeth didn't respond herself. Instead, she sent lawyers. Aggressive, expensive lawyers from the most prestigious firms. They threatened to sue. They claimed the reporting was wrong. They tried to intimidate Carreyrou and the Wall Street Journal into dropping the story, but Carreyrou had the sources, he had the documents, he had former employees willing to go on record, and the Wall Street Journal had the resources to fight. They stood by their reporter. In October 2015, the first article published. The headline was devastating. It raised serious questions about whether Theranos' technology actually worked. The article described how the company was using traditional commercial machines for most tests rather than their proprietary devices. It quoted former employees who said the Edison devices were unreliable and rarely used. It presented evidence that the company had misled partners and investors about its capabilities. This was a direct assault on the foundation of Theranos' story. Elizabeth fought back hard. She went on television. She gave interviews. She called the article false and misleading. She attacked Carreyrou personally. She suggested he was biased and had an agenda. She doubled down on every claim. The technology works. The company is changing healthcare. The critics are wrong. She projected absolute confidence. For a while it seemed like this might work. Some people believed Elizabeth, some investors stood by the company, some partners maintained their relationships. The company had built up so much credibility that one negative article, even from the Wall Street Journal, didn't immediately destroy it. But Carreyrou kept investigating. He kept publishing articles. More former employees came forward. More evidence emerged. Regulatory agencies started paying attention. The Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services, which regulates medical labs, launched an inspection of Theranos facilities, and what they found was damning. The inspection reports revealed serious deficiencies, quality control failures, inaccurate test results, failure to follow proper protocols. The issues were so serious that the regulators threatened to ban Elizabeth from owning or operating a medical lab for 2 years. This was a catastrophic finding. It validated everything the Wall Street Journal had reported. Partners started pulling out. Walgreens terminated their agreement. Safeway ended their partnership after having invested hundreds of millions in infrastructure. The testing centers closed. Investors started demanding answers. The valuation started collapsing. The company that had been worth $9 billion was suddenly worth nothing. Elizabeth tried to save it. She raised more money, though at a dramatically reduced valuation. She brought in new management. She promised reforms and transparency. But the damage was done. The trust was broken. More importantly, the fundamental problem remained. The technology still didn't work. It had never worked, and no amount of PR or management changes could fix that. By 2016, Theranos was in crisis mode. By 2017, the company was essentially defunct, and by 2018, federal prosecutors filed criminal charges against Elizabeth Holmes and her boyfriend. The charges were serious: conspiracy to commit wire fraud, multiple counts of wire fraud. They were accused of lying to investors, to partners, to doctors, and to patients. The potential sentence was decades in prison. The trial didn't happen immediately. There were delays, legal maneuvering. The defense needed time to prepare. Elizabeth had a child, which delayed proceedings further. But eventually in 2021, the trial began. And it was one of the most closely watched white-collar criminal trials in years. The prosecution's case was straightforward. They argued that Elizabeth had knowingly lied about the capabilities of Theranos technology, that she had shown investors fake demonstrations, that she had fabricated validation documents, that she had misrepresented partnerships and endorsements, that she had done all of this to raise money and build her company on a foundation of lies. They brought former employees to testify. They showed emails and internal documents. They presented evidence of fake lab reports shown to investors. They demonstrated how the demonstrations were rigged. They showed that Elizabeth knew the technology didn't work, but continued to make false claims. The evidence was overwhelming. Elizabeth's defense was more complex. Her lawyers argued that she had genuinely believed in the technology, that she was a young, inexperienced CEO who made mistakes but didn't have criminal intent, that she had been overly optimistic but not fraudulent, and crucially, they argued that she had been manipulated and abused by her much older boyfriend, who had controlled many aspects of the company and her life. This abuse defense was controversial. Some saw it as a legitimate explanation of how a young woman could have been influenced by an older, domineering partner. Others saw it as a cynical attempt to avoid responsibility by playing the victim card. The truth was probably somewhere in between. There likely was a problematic power dynamic in their relationship, but that didn't erase Elizabeth's own choices and actions. The trial lasted months. Witness after witness testified. Documents were entered into evidence. Recordings of Elizabeth making false claims were played for the jury. The prosecution painted a picture of systematic, deliberate fraud. The defense tried to create reasonable doubt about intent. In January 2022, the jury reached a verdict: guilty. Elizabeth Holmes was convicted on 4 counts of fraud. She was acquitted on some counts and the jury deadlocked on others, but the core verdict was clear: she had committed fraud. She had lied to investors. She would face prison time. Sentencing came later. The prosecution asked for 15 years. The defense argued for probation or minimal prison time. In November 2022, the judge sentenced Elizabeth to 11 years and 3 months in federal prison. She was also ordered to pay hundreds of millions in restitution to investors. Elizabeth reported to prison in May 2023. She is currently serving her sentence at a federal facility. She has filed appeals, but most legal experts believe those appeals will fail. She will likely serve most of her sentence. The youngest self-made female billionaire in history is now federal prisoner number 87339035. So what did we learn from this story? First, the power of narrative and charisma. Elizabeth was able to raise hundreds of millions of dollars, convince major corporations to partner with her, and fool some of the smartest people in business. She did this primarily through force of personality carefully crafted image, and compelling storytelling. The lesson is that skepticism matters, verification matters, trust but verify. Second, the danger of echo chambers and confirmation bias. Once Theranos reached a certain level of prestige, people stopped asking hard questions. If Fortune magazine wrote glowing profiles, if famous investors backed the company, if major corporations partnered with them, surely the technology must work. Each endorsement became evidence for the next endorsement. Nobody wanted to be the skeptic who missed out. Third, the importance of technical expertise in evaluating technical claims. Most of the investors in Theranos had no background in medical diagnostics. They couldn't personally evaluate whether the technology was feasible. They relied on Elizabeth's claims and on the credentials of the people around her. But those credentials were in business and politics, not science. The board included former cabinet secretaries but no medical testing experts. This was a red flag nobody noticed. Fourth, the role of secrecy in enabling fraud. Theranos operated in extreme secrecy. Employees signed strict non-disclosure agreements. Visitors were shown carefully controlled demonstrations. Independent validation was prevented under claims of protecting trade secrets. This secrecy wasn't protecting innovation, it was hiding fraud. Legitimate companies welcome scrutiny, fraudulent ones avoid it. Fifth, the vulnerability of even sophisticated investors to fraud. The people who invested in Theranos weren't unsophisticated. They included billionaires, venture capital firms, and experienced business leaders, but they were still fooled. This shows that fraud isn't just about intelligence. It's about psychology, about wanting to believe, about fear of missing out. Smarts. People can make dumb decisions when the story is compelling enough. The Elizabeth Holmes case also raises questions about Silicon Valley culture. The emphasis on disruption and moving fast and breaking things. The celebration of young dropout founders who challenge conventional wisdom. The willingness to invest in moonshot ideas with minimal evidence. These cultural factors create an environment where someone like Elizabeth can thrive, at least for a while. There's also a gender dimension to the story that's complicated. On one hand, Elizabeth was celebrated as a rare female founder in tech. She was held up as proof that women could succeed in this male-dominated field. Investors and media may have been less skeptical because they wanted her to succeed. They wanted the narrative of the successful female entrepreneur. This may have given her more benefit of the doubt than a male founder would have received. On the other hand, when the fraud was exposed, some of the criticism and mockery she received focused on her appearance and behavior in gendered ways that male fraudsters don't experience. The fascination with her voice and her turtlenecks had a gendered quality to it. Male founders aren't scrutinized for their vocal pitch or fashion choices in the same way. The human cost of the Theranos fraud shouldn't be forgotten. Yes, wealthy investors lost money, but more importantly, patients received inaccurate medical test results. Some people made serious medical decisions based on faulty information. Employees dedicated years of their careers to what they thought was meaningful work, only to discover they were part of a fraud. Partners like Walgreens and Safeway wasted hundreds of millions of dollars and damaged their reputations. The investors who lost money included some who could afford it, but also included some smaller investors and employees who lost significant portions of their savings. The human impact extended far beyond just Elizabeth and her company. Fraud always has ripple effects. From a legal and regulatory perspective, the case highlights gaps in oversight of private companies. Theranos was able to operate for years making medical claims and performing medical tests without proper regulatory scrutiny. Part of this was because they were a lab, which has different oversight than a device manufacturer. Part was because they actively evaded scrutiny. But it shows that the regulatory system isn't perfect. The case also demonstrated the important role of whistleblowers and investigative journalism. Without former employees willing to come forward, and without a reporter willing to invest time in a complex investigation, Theranos might have continued the fraud longer. This shows why protecting whistleblowers and supporting quality journalism matters. Looking at Elizabeth Holmes as an individual, the psychological profile is fascinating. She clearly had enormous ambition and drive from a young age. She was willing to work incredibly hard to build her company, but somewhere along the way, she crossed a line from optimism and determination into deliberate fraud. When did that happen? Was there a specific moment, or was it a gradual slide? Some people who study fraudsters talk about the slippery slope. You start with small exaggerations, the technology doesn't quite work yet, but you're confident it will, so you oversell a bit. Then it still doesn't work, but you've raised money based on your claims, so you can't admit failure, so you exaggerate more. You demonstrate features that don't exist yet, but surely will soon. And each step normalizes the next step until you're deeply into fraud without having made a single dramatic decision to become a criminal. This may be what happened with Elizabeth. She genuinely believed in her vision. She thought the technology was possible. She was confident her team would solve the problems. So she sold the future as if it were the present. And when the future didn't arrive on schedule, she couldn't admit it. She had investors, partners, employees, and her own ego invested in the story. So she kept going, kept lying, kept hoping that somehow the technology would eventually work and retroactively justify everything. But it never did. The fundamental science didn't support what she was trying to do, and no amount of ambition or confidence or force of will could change the laws of chemistry. This is a lesson about the limits of positive thinking and hustle culture. Believing in yourself is important, but belief doesn't alter physical reality. You can't manifest technology that violates scientific principles. The comparison to Steve Jobs is instructive. Elizabeth modeled herself after Jobs, but there's a crucial difference. Jobs had actual working products. The original Mac might have had limitations, but it was a real computer that did what Apple claimed. The iPhone was genuinely revolutionary. Jobs was selling reality, even if he sometimes exaggerated its capabilities. Elizabeth was selling fiction. Jobs also had technical partners like Steve Wozniak, who actually built the products. Elizabeth had scientists and engineers, but they were working on impossible specifications. When they told her something couldn't be done, she didn't pivot or adjust. She just found ways to hide the failure. This is where ambition becomes delusion. The deep voice is such a perfect metaphor for the whole fraud. She literally presented a fake version of herself. The voice wasn't real, it was a performance, a tool to manipulate perception. And just like the voice, the technology was a performance. The demonstrations were fake. The claims were fabricated. Everything was designed to create an illusion of something that didn't exist. What's particularly striking is how many smart people fell for it. The board of Theranos included incredibly accomplished individuals, former secretaries of state, generals, business leaders. These weren't fools, but they were outside their expertise. They weren't medical or scientific experts. They lent credibility without being able to actually evaluate the core claims. This is a common pattern in fraud. Surround yourself with impressive people in unrelated fields to create the appearance of validation. The legal outcome feels appropriate to many observers. 11 years is serious prison time. It sends a message that fraud has consequences, but some think it's too harsh, noting that Elizabeth didn't physically hurt anyone, and that financial fraud sentences are often lighter. Others think it's too lenient given the scale of the fraud and the potential medical harm. There's no perfect answer on appropriate punishment. What's certain is that Elizabeth Holmes will be remembered as one of the most significant fraudsters of the 21st century. Her story has already been told in books, documentaries, and a television series. She's become a cultural symbol, a cautionary tale, a case study taught in business schools and law schools. The Theranos failure did real damage to legitimate blood testing innovation. Other companies working on improving diagnostics now face increased skepticism. Investors are more cautious, regulators are more stringent. This is an unfortunate consequence. Fraud doesn't just hurt the immediate victims, it creates distrust that affects everyone in the field. For Silicon Valley, the case was a wake-up call about the dangers of hype culture and insufficient due diligence. Many investors now claim they've learned lessons. They're more skeptical of charismatic founders making extraordinary claims. They demand more proof. They bring in technical experts. Whether these lessons stick remains to be seen. Human nature and competitive pressures might override caution in the next exciting opportunity. The story also resonates beyond business. It's about truth and lies, about the difference between vision and delusion, about how easy it is to believe what we want to believe, about the importance of asking hard questions even when you desperately want the answers to be what you hope. These are universal themes. Elizabeth Holmes is currently appealing her conviction. Her lawyers argue various grounds for overturning the verdict. Most legal experts believe these appeals will fail. The evidence was strong, The trial was fair, the conviction will likely stand, she will serve most of her sentence, she will emerge from prison in her early 40s, still relatively young but with a permanently damaged reputation. What happens after prison? Does she rebuild in some way? Does she become an advocate or speaker about the dangers of fraud? Does she disappear from public life? These questions remain unanswered. Her story is still being written, though the most dramatic chapters are likely complete. The final question is whether Elizabeth truly understands what she did wrong. Does she accept responsibility? Or does she still see herself as a visionary who was simply ahead of her time and unfairly persecuted? Her statements and behavior suggest she struggles with full accountability. She has expressed regret for mistakes but hasn't fully acknowledged deliberate fraud. This psychological denial might make her sentence harder to serve, but might also be necessary for her to live with herself. This is the complete story of Elizabeth Holmes, from ambitious Stanford student to celebrated billionaire to convicted fraudster, from magazine covers to a prison cell, from the next Steve Jobs to a case study in everything that can go wrong when ambition overtakes ethics, when narrative overtakes truth, and when nobody asks the hard questions until it's too late. The youngest self-made female billionaire became the youngest high-profile female white-collar criminal. Her company that was supposed to revolutionize healthcare became one of the most infamous frauds in Silicon Valley history. The technology that was going to save lives never worked at all. And the woman who was going to change the world is serving 11 years in federal prison for fraud. Thanks for watching. If you want more deep dives into the biggest frauds, scandals, and business disasters, subscribe to the channel. We break down the most insane stories in business and finance. Thanks for watching. But there's something even more fascinating we need to understand about how this all happened. Because the story of Elizabeth Holmes isn't just about one woman lying. It's about an entire system that enabled, encouraged, and profited from those lies until everything collapsed. And the details of how she maintained the deception for so long reveals something deeply disturbing about how we evaluate success and truth. Let's go back to those early days at Theranos, because there's a pattern that developed that would repeat for years. Elizabeth would make a claim about what the technology could do. Engineers would tell her it wasn't possible with current science, and instead of accepting that limitation, she would simply insist they make it work anyway. When they couldn't, she didn't change the claim, she just found ways to fake it. One former employee described a meeting where Elizabeth told the engineering team that the device needed to run 240 different blood tests from a single drop of blood. An engineer raised his hand and explained why this was physically impossible. The sample size was too small. The chemical reactions would interfere with each other. The technology to do this didn't exist anywhere in the world. Elizabeth's response, she told him he was thinking too small. That innovation required breaking through impossible barriers, that Steve Jobs had been told the iPhone was impossible, that every great advance in history was considered impossible until someone did it. This sounds inspirational, it sounds like visionary leadership. But there's a crucial difference between ambitious and impossible. The iPhone was ambitious, but based on existing technology assembled in new ways. What Elizabeth was proposing violated fundamental laws of chemistry, but she didn't understand this distinction, or she did understand it and didn't care. Either way, she kept making the promises and the engineers kept failing to deliver, and that's when the real fraud began in earnest. The company started developing what insiders called the facade. This was the public-facing version of Theranos that bore little resemblance to reality. When investors visited, they were shown a carefully choreographed demonstration. They would see the sleek Edison device. They would watch as a technician pricked a finger and placed a drop of blood in the machine. A screen would display test results within minutes. What the investors didn't see was the room behind the demonstration area. That's where the real testing happened. Employees would take the blood sample and run it through traditional commercial testing machines made by other companies. These were the same machines used by every other lab in the country. The Edison device on display was just an expensive prop, but the deception went even deeper than that, because even those commercial machines couldn't run reliable tests on the tiny finger prick samples. Blood from a finger prick is different from blood drawn from a vein. It contains more cellular debris, it's more likely to clot, it's harder to work with. So even when Theranos was using conventional equipment, the results were often inaccurate. This created a genuine health crisis that most people still don't fully understand. Real patients were getting real blood tests that were giving them wrong information about their health. Someone might get a test saying they had sky-high cholesterol when they didn't. They would start taking medication they didn't need. Or worse, someone might get a test saying everything was fine when they actually had a serious condition developing. One woman got a pregnancy test at Theranos that came back negative. She trusted the result and continued taking medication that would have been harmful to a developing fetus. Later, she found out she had been pregnant. She was devastated. How many other cases like this were there? We'll never know the full extent because Theranos destroyed or lost to many of their records. But Elizabeth kept moving forward. Keep this in mind because it shows the mindset. She knew the technology didn't work. She knew patients were getting bad results. She knew she was lying to investors and partners, and she kept going. This wasn't a mistake. This wasn't optimism. This was deliberate, sustained fraud carried out over years with full knowledge of the harm being done. The people around her fell into different categories. Some truly believed in the mission and were kept in the dark about the problems. These were the rank and file employees who thought they were working for a revolutionary healthcare company. They did their jobs, trusted their leaders, and had no idea they were part of a fraud. When they eventually found out, many were traumatized. Their careers and reputations were damaged. Some faced financial hardship. Then there were the employees who knew something was wrong but didn't speak up. Maybe they needed the job. Maybe they were afraid of retaliation. Maybe they convinced themselves it would eventually be fixed. These people lived in moral gray areas, complicit through silence. Some of them later cooperated with investigators and expressed deep regret. Others disappeared and tried to move on. And then there was the inner circle, the people who actively participated in the fraud, the people who helped create fake demos, who fabricated data, who lied to partners and regulators. Some of these people were charged with crimes. Elizabeth's boyfriend, who ran operations, was also indicted and convicted. He received a shorter sentence than Elizabeth, but still went to prison. Other executives managed to avoid criminal charges, but their reputations were destroyed. The boyfriend's role deserves more examination because it's one of the most disturbing elements of the story. He was nearly 20 years older than Elizabeth. He had no medical or scientific background. Before Theranos, he had worked in technology and software, but nothing related to medical diagnostics. Yet Elizabeth made him the chief operating officer and gave him enormous power. He created a culture of fear and intimidation. Employees were monitored. Their communications were tracked. People suspected of disloyalty were fired immediately and sometimes threatened with lawsuits. The office had security cameras everywhere. Lawyers sent threatening letters to anyone who left the company and tried to speak publicly. It was less like a startup and more like a cult. Elizabeth and her boyfriend were also in a romantic relationship, which created another layer of complexity. How much did he manipulate her? How much did she manipulate him? How much were they equal partners in the fraud? These questions came up during the trial when Elizabeth's lawyers tried to argue she had been under his psychological control. Some people found this defense credible. Others saw it as Elizabeth trying to shift blame. The truth is probably that they enabled each other. He provided the operational ruthlessness to maintain the fraud. She provided the vision and charisma to sell it. Together, they created a system where lying became normal, where critics were silenced, and where the truth was whatever they said it was. This partnership was toxic and ultimately criminal. Now let's talk about the board of directors, because this is where things get really interesting from a corporate governance perspective. Elizabeth assembled one of the most impressive boards in Silicon Valley. Former cabinet secretaries, retired generals, famous politicians, business legends, the credentials were impeccable. This board gave Theranos enormous credibility. But here's the problem, almost none of them had any expertise in medical diagnostics or laboratory science. They were experts in foreign policy, military strategy, and government. Impressive credentials, but completely irrelevant to evaluating whether Theranos technology actually worked. And that was by design. Elizabeth didn't want experts who could question the technology. She wanted famous names who would attract investors and open doors. The board members were also kept in the dark about many issues. They received sanitized reports. They were shown the same fake demonstrations given to investors. When technical problems came up, Elizabeth and her team would describe them as normal startup challenges that were being worked on. The board trusted management, After all, why would Elizabeth lie to them? Some board members did eventually become concerned and asked harder questions. A few resigned when they didn't get satisfactory answers, but many stayed on even as red flags accumulated. They had invested their reputations in the company. They wanted to believe it would succeed, and they were presumably being paid well for their board service. These factors created powerful incentives to avoid looking too closely. This reveals something important about how prestige and credentials can actually enable fraud. In a normal company, having accomplished board members provides oversight and guidance. But when those board members are outside their expertise and being actively deceived, their presence doesn't add oversight. It adds credibility that helps the fraud continue. Their names became tools that Elizabeth used to convince others. The investors who put money into Theranos followed a similar pattern. Some did careful due diligence and decided not to invest. These were usually the investors who brought in medical or scientific experts to evaluate the technology. When experts looked closely, they found problems. The claims didn't add up. The data was incomplete. Red flags appeared. Smart investors walked away, but many investors didn't do this level of diligence. They looked at who else had invested. They looked at the board. They looked at the partnerships with major companies. They looked at the media coverage. They looked at Elizabeth herself with her Stanford background and compelling story. They made a pattern matching decision. This looks like a successful Silicon Valley startup. Therefore, it probably is one. This is how investing often works at the highest levels. It's not always about carefully analyzing the fundamentals. It's about networks and pattern recognition and fear of missing out. If other smart people are investing, you want to invest too. If Fortune magazine is writing glowing profiles, the company must be legitimate. Each data point of credibility becomes evidence for the next investment. The media's role in building and maintaining the Theranos myth cannot be overstated. Elizabeth was featured in countless articles, profiles, and television appearances. She was treated as a visionary, a genius, the future of healthcare. Journalists wrote about her turtlenecks and her voice and her dedication and her ambition, but very few asked hard technical questions about whether the technology actually worked. Why did this happen? Several reasons. First, most business journalists don't have scientific backgrounds. They can't personally evaluate complex medical technology. They rely on what sources tell them. Second, access matters in journalism. If you write critical articles, sources stop talking to you. Elizabeth's team was sophisticated about managing media. They granted access to friendly journalists and froze out skeptical ones. Third, the story was just too good to resist. A young female Stanford dropout building a revolutionary healthcare company was an irresistible narrative. Editors wanted that story. Readers wanted that story. There was pressure to write the hero narrative rather than the skeptical investigation, and Theranos actively encouraged this by making Elizabeth available for the right kind of coverage while avoiding tough interviews. The one journalist who did ask hard questions was the Wall Street Journal reporter who eventually exposed the fraud, and he faced enormous resistance. Theranos hired expensive lawyers to threaten him and his newspaper. They tried to pressure his sources to recant. They called his editors to complain. They did everything possible to kill the story. The fact that it still got published is a testament to the reporter's persistence and his newspaper's willingness to stand behind him. When that first article came out raising questions about Theranos, Elizabeth's response is telling. She didn't address the substance. She attacked the messenger. She went on television and said the article was false and motivated by bias. She said the reporter had an agenda. She said competitors were trying to destroy her. Company. She projected confidence and dismissed criticism, and for a while this worked. Many people believed her over the newspaper. This is a classic fraud response. When caught, attack the credibility of the accusers, make it about their motives rather than the facts, create doubt about their reliability, shift the conversation away from whether the allegations are true to whether the accusers can be trusted. It's a tried and tested strategy because it often works, at least temporarily. But the Wall Street Journal kept publishing articles, more former employees came forward, more evidence emerged, the regulatory inspection found serious problems, partners started pulling out, the narrative began to shift. What had been a story of unfair criticism of a successful company became a story of possible fraud. The media that had built Elizabeth up now started tearing her down. The fall was dramatic and swift. Within months, Theranos went from $9 billion valuation to worthless. The testing centers closed, employees were laid off, partners sued for their wasted investments, patients filed lawsuits over inaccurate test results, and federal prosecutors opened a criminal investigation. The pyramid Elizabeth had built was collapsing. During this collapse, Elizabeth tried various strategies to save the company. She raised new money at a much lower valuation. She brought in new management. She promised reforms and transparency. She gave interviews saying she took responsibility and would fix the problems, but these were empty gestures. The fundamental issue remained. The technology never worked and couldn't work given the constraints of physics and chemistry. She also tried to develop new products and pivot the company. Maybe they couldn't do comprehensive testing from a finger prick, but they could do something else. Maybe a different application of the technology. But these efforts went nowhere. The company had no real technology. It had lies and props and sophisticated fraud infrastructure. You can't pivot a company that's built on nothing. The decision to charge her criminally was significant. White-collar fraud cases are complex and difficult to prove. You have to show not just that false statements were made, but that they were made with intent to defraud. You have to prove the defendant knew the claims were false and made them anyway to get money or other benefits. This is hard to establish beyond reasonable doubt, but in Elizabeth's case, prosecutors had overwhelming evidence. They had internal emails where she discussed knowing about problems. They had testimony from employees who heard her acknowledge that demonstrations were fake. They had documents showing she approved fabricated reports given to investors. They had recordings of her making false claims publicly. The case was strong. Her defense strategy at trial was fascinating. Her lawyers didn't try to argue the technology worked. They couldn't. The evidence was too clear. Instead, they argued she genuinely believed it would work eventually, that she was optimistic and ambitious but not criminal, that startup founders often oversell their vision, that she made mistakes but didn't have criminal intent. They also argued the abuse defense, that her older boyfriend had controlled her, that she had been manipulated and psychologically dominated, that he was the real mastermind and she was partially a victim. This was controversial because it seemed to rely on stereotypes about women being easily influenced, but it also had some factual basis. The power dynamics in their relationship were clearly problematic. The prosecution countered by showing Elizabeth's active role in every aspect of the fraud. She signed the fake reports, she gave the false interviews, she personally demonstrated the fake technology, she threatened employees who raised concerns. She wasn't a passive victim. She was an active participant who made conscious choices to lie and defraud. The jury heard weeks of testimony. They saw hundreds of documents. They watched videos of Elizabeth making false claims. They heard from investors who lost hundreds of millions based on her lies. They heard from patients who got incorrect test results. They heard from employees who were threatened and intimidated. And after deliberating, they found her guilty. The conviction on 4 counts was a mixed verdict. She was acquitted on some charges, the jury deadlocked on others, but the core finding was clear. She had committed fraud. She had lied to investors. She knew she was lying. She did it to raise money. She was criminally responsible for her actions. Sentencing took months. During that time, Elizabeth gave birth to another child. She filed motions for a new trial. She gave interviews maintaining her innocence. She seemed to be hoping that public sympathy or legal technicalities might save her from prison. But when sentencing day came, the judge was clear. This was serious fraud with serious consequences. 11 years and 3 months in federal prison. The sentence sparked debate. Some thought it was too harsh, noting that she didn't physically harm anyone, and that other fraudsters had received lighter sentences. They pointed out that she was a first-time offender who had been punished by losing everything. They argued that prison time was excessive, given she could do more good by working and paying restitution. Others thought the sentence was too light, given the scale of the fraud and the potential medical harm. They noted that she had shown little remorse and continued to avoid full responsibility. They argued that the sentence needed to be severe enough to deter future founders from similar behavior. They wanted to see consequences that matched the crime. From the judge's perspective, the sentence balanced multiple factors: the seriousness of the fraud, the amount of money lost, the number of victims, the breach of trust, the potential medical harm. Against this was Elizabeth's age, her lack of criminal history, and her family situation. The judge concluded that 11 years was appropriate, severe enough to punish and deter, but not the maximum possible. Elizabeth reported to prison in May 2023. She is currently serving her sentence at a minimum security federal facility. These facilities are sometimes called club fed because they're less harsh than higher security prisons, but they're still prison. She's away from her family, she's lost her freedom, she's surrounded by other inmates. The reality of federal prison, even minimum security, is no joke. She has filed appeals arguing various legal errors in her trial. Her lawyers claim the judge made mistakes in evidentiary rulings. They argue the prosecution made improper statements. They claim the abuse defense should have been given more weight. Most legal experts believe these appeals will fail. The trial was carefully conducted. The evidence was strong. Appeals courts rarely overturn convictions in cases this solid. Assuming her appeals fail, Elizabeth will serve most of her sentence. With good behavior, she might get released after 9 or 10 years. She'll be in her early 40s when she gets out. Still relatively young, but her reputation permanently destroyed. What does someone like Elizabeth Holmes do after prison? Can she rebuild any kind of life? These questions remain unanswered. The broader impact of the Theranos scandal extends beyond Elizabeth personally. It's affected how investors evaluate healthcare startups. There's more skepticism now, more demands for proof, more insistence on independent validation. Some legitimate companies have suffered because investors are gun-shy after being burned by Theranos. This is an unfortunate side effect, but probably necessary. The scandal also sparked changes in how medical laboratories are regulated. There was always supposed to be oversight, but Theranos had managed to evade it through legal maneuvering and secrecy. Now regulators are more vigilant, there's more surprise inspections, more demands for transparency. Again, this makes life harder for legitimate companies, but protects the public. In Silicon Valley culture, the scandal prompted some soul searching, the celebration of young dropout founders, the emphasis on fake it until you make it, the acceptance of aggressive exaggeration. All of these cultural elements were questioned. Some people argued the culture needed to change. Others said Theranos was an outlier and the culture is fine. The debate continues. Business schools now teach the Theranos case as an example of corporate fraud and failure of governance. Students analyze what went wrong. They discuss how to avoid similar situations. They debate ethical questions about ambition and deception. The case has become a standard part of business education. Elizabeth Holmes is now a cautionary tale taught to future business leaders. The human stories behind the fraud deserve remembering. The employees who dedicated years to what they thought was meaningful work. The patients who made medical decisions based on false information. The investors who lost retirement savings, the partners who wasted hundreds of millions. These weren't abstract losses, these were real people whose lives were affected. Some former Theranos employees have spoken publicly about their experiences. They described the excitement of joining a company that was going to change healthcare, the gradual realization that something was wrong, the moral struggle of whether to stay or leave or speak out, the fear of retaliation, the ultimate decision to become whistleblowers. These are difficult personal stories of people trying to do the right thing in complicated circumstances. The investors who lost money have been more quiet, some because they're embarrassed at being fooled, some because they signed settlement agreements with confidentiality clauses, some because they've moved on and don't want to relive it, but their losses were real. Some lost hundreds of millions of dollars. For the largest investors, this might have been a small percentage of their wealth. For smaller investors, it could have been devastating. Looking at Elizabeth Holmes as a case study in psychology and criminality raises fascinating questions. Was she a sociopath who never cared about truth or other people? Or was she someone who started with good intentions and gradually slid into fraud through a series of small compromises? The evidence suggests the latter. She probably did initially believe she could build the technology she envisioned, but when reality didn't cooperate, she chose to fake it rather than fail. This is the slippery slope theory of fraud. You start by overselling a bit. Your prototype doesn't quite work, but you're confident it will soon, so you demonstrate it as if it does. Then it still doesn't work, but you've raised money based on those demonstrations, so you can't admit failure. So you oversell more. And each step normalizes the next step until you're deeply into criminal fraud. At some point, Elizabeth crossed from ambitious exaggeration into deliberate fraud. That moment probably can't be precisely identified. It was likely a gradual transition. But at some point, she knew the technology didn't work and couldn't work, and she continued to raise money by claiming it did. That's fraud, and she's now paying the price. The comparison to other famous fraudsters is inevitable. She's been compared to Madoff, to the Enron executives, to other white-collar criminals. Some comparisons are fair. All of these cases involve lying to investors and misrepresenting reality. All involve charismatic leaders who convinced people to believe in something that wasn't real. All ultimately collapsed when reality couldn't be hidden anymore. But there are differences. Elizabeth wasn't running a Ponzi scheme like Madoff. She wasn't manipulating energy markets like Enron. She was making false claims about technology and using those claims to raise money and build a company. The fraud was different in its mechanics, even if the outcome was similar. People lost money, trust was betrayed, criminals went to prison. What makes Elizabeth's story particularly resonant is the Silicon Valley context and the female founder angle. This wasn't some Wall Street insider running a complex financial scheme. This was a young woman with an inspiring story building a healthcare company. The narrative was so compelling that it blinded people to warning signs. The desire to believe in the story overcame skepticism about the substance. This connects to broader issues about narrative versus reality in business and investing. Stories matter. They shape how we perceive companies and founders. A good story can attract investment, talent, and partnerships. But a story without substance is just fiction. The challenge is distinguishing between ambitious vision backed by real capability and compelling narrative backed by nothing. Theranos showed how hard that can be. The role of gender in Elizabeth's story is complex and deserves careful consideration. On one hand, being a rare woman founder in tech gave her certain advantages. Media loved the narrative. Some investors may have been less skeptical because they wanted her to succeed. There was definitely an element of celebrating her as proof that women could make it in Silicon Valley. On the other hand, when the fraud was exposed, some of the coverage and criticism had gendered elements. The focus on her appearance, her voice, her relationships. Male fraudsters don't face the same kind of personal scrutiny. There was an element of schadenfreude about the woman who dared to reach so high, falling so hard. Both dynamics can be true simultaneously. What's certain is that Elizabeth used every tool available to her. Her youth, her gender, her Stanford credentials, her family connections, her carefully crafted image. She was strategic about building a persona that would open doors and attract investment. There's nothing wrong with that in principle. Founders need to sell their vision. But when the vision is based on lies, the persona becomes part of the fraud. The 11 years she's serving will give her plenty of time to reflect on choices made and consequences faced. Will she emerge with genuine remorse and understanding of the harm caused, or will she maintain the victim narrative and blame others? Prison can change people, but not always for the better. Some people emerge genuinely reformed, others emerge bitter and resentful. Elizabeth's path remains to be seen. For now, she's federal inmate 8733935. The woman who was once on magazine covers as the future of healthcare is now in a prison jumpsuit, serving over a decade for fraud. The transformation is complete, from Stanford to startup to scandal to prison. This is the Elizabeth Holmes story. The legacy of Theranos will outlive Elizabeth's prison sentence. It's already influenced how we think about startups, about due diligence, about the importance of technical expertise in evaluating technical claims. It's become a cultural reference point. When someone makes extraordinary claims about revolutionary technology, people say, remember Theranos, remember Elizabeth Holmes, don't get fooled again. Whether that lesson sticks remains to be seen. Human nature doesn't change. The desire to believe in revolutionary technology is strong. The fear of missing the next big thing is powerful. The next Elizabeth Holmes is probably out there right now. building a company on exaggeration that might slide into fraud if reality doesn't cooperate with vision. The question is whether we'll catch them earlier this time. This complete story of Elizabeth Holmes spans from youthful ambition to historic fraud to federal prison. It encompasses themes of innovation and deception, success and failure, trust and betrayal. It's a story that will be told and retold because it captures something essential about ambition, ethics, and what happens when the two come into conflict. And it serves as a permanent warning about the dangers of believing what we want to believe instead of demanding proof of what's actually true. Thanks for watching this deep dive into one of the most fascinating frauds in modern business history. Subscribe for more stories about the biggest scams, scandals, and financial disasters that shaped our world. We make complex business stories understandable and compelling. New video every week. Thanks for watching.